I have stood on a lot of flight lines in my life, and I have learned that you can tell almost everything about a unit by how the men talk about the pilot nobody respects. So when I climbed off the resupply bird at Firebase Calder with my notebook and my bad knee and my 40 years of writing about other men's wars, the first thing I did, before I found my bunk, before I found the coffee, was listen. What I heard was laughter, and the laughter had a name attached to it, and the name was hers. I should tell you who I am, though it doesn't matter much to the story except as a measure of how wrong an old hand can be. They called me Maddox. I had been a rifleman a long time ago, in a war the young men at Calder thought of the way I had once thought of my grandfather's war, as a sepia thing, slow and far away. After that I spent my life writing about soldiers. I had filed from a dozen valleys with names no one back home could pronounce, and I had grown proud, the way you do, of being able to read a unit in an afternoon. I thought I could walk onto any firebase in the world and know within an hour who the lions were and who the jackals were and who would break. Calder was a wet place. It sat on a shoulder of high ground where two ridgelines came together, and below it the land dropped away into a country of fog. In the mornings the cloud lay in the valleys like spilled milk, and you could stand at the wire and look out over a sea of white with the black teeth of the far ridges poking through, and you would forget there was a road down there at all. There was a road. It ran along the floor of a defile so narrow the men called it the throat, and through that throat went every truck, every casualty, every can of fuel and crate of ammunition that kept Calder alive. The throat was the firebase's windpipe, and like a windpipe it could be closed. The unit at Calder was a mongrel thing, which is part of why I had come. There were infantrymen of our own, and there were soldiers of two allied armies who spoke other languages and prayed in other directions and had their own ideas about how a war should be fought. There were engineers and gunners and a small clinic and a tactical operations center humming in a sandbagged hut. And on the eastern pad, under camouflage netting and a constant drizzle, there were the helicopters, the lean gray attack ships the men loved, and the fatter utility birds the men did not love, and one of each was usually turning at any hour of the day. The man who ran the laughter was a warrant officer named Prout. He was the troop's celebrated gun pilot, and I will say this for him, he was good and he knew he was good, and the knowing had not yet curdled into the worst of what that does to a man, though it was well along. He was broad and easy and quick, the kind of officer the younger soldiers orbit because his confidence feels like warmth. He flew the gun bird, the attack ship, and when he came back from a run he came back loose-shouldered and grinning, and men gathered to hear him tell it. I liked him at first. I am not too proud to admit that. The captain, her name was Cole, Marin Cole, though it took me 3 days to learn it because no one at Calder used it, flew the utility runs. She hauled. She ran the resupply lift down to the strongpoints along the throat and brought the wounded back up to the clinic. In the talk of the firebase she was the taxi. That was the word said with a grin, the way men say a thing that is cruel and think it is only funny. The taxi, the medevac girl. On my second evening I heard Prout say it to a circle of young soldiers by the fuel point, and the line he used I remember exactly because I wrote it down that night, and because I have been ashamed of the small chuckle it pulled out of me ever since. We don't hand the gun bird, he said, to somebody whose whole job is hauling cargo and body bags. The young men laughed. I half laughed. She was 20 meters away, going over her aircraft in the rain with a flashlight in her teeth, running her gloved hand along a rotor blade the way a horseman runs his hand down a leg, and if she heard it she gave no sign at all. She finished the blade. She moved to the next one. The rain came down off the netting in long silver threads, and she worked under it as though the weather were a thing she had made a private peace with. That was the first thing I noticed about her before I knew anything else, and I noticed it the way you notice a detail you don't yet understand is important. She did not hurry, and she did not flinch, and she did not perform. Prout performed. The young men performed. The whole firebase in its way performed for me, for each other, for the version of themselves they wanted to be true. She did not. She checked her aircraft as if the aircraft were the only audience that counted, and then she signed the book, and then she walked off into the dark toward the operations center to draw the morning's tasking. And the tasking would be, as it always was, the taxi runs down the throat. I had come to Calder to write about Prout and men like him. The gun pilots. That was the story, the one my editor wanted and the one I had half written in my head on the flight, in the cavalry of the air, the young lions, the swagger and the skill. I want you to understand that because the story I am telling you now is the one I did not come to write, and I tore the other one up, and I have never been sorry. For 3 days I watched her work, and I learned the thing the men at Calder either did not see or did not care to. The taxi runs were the hardest flying on that firebase, and she did them better than anyone alive. You have to understand the fog. The gun birds flew when the weather let them. Prut would go up in the clear mornings and the bright afternoons and do beautiful violent work and come back grinning, and that was real. I am not taking it from him. But the fog did not keep a schedule, and the strongpoints down the throat needed fuel and water and bullets and bandages whether the sun shone or not, and the wounded did not bleed on a clear weather timetable. So when the cloud came down and the ceiling dropped to nothing, and the smart thing, the book thing, the thing every other pilot did was to sit on the pad and wait, the resupply still had to fly. And it was Cole who flew it. I rode with her once. I want to tell you about that because it is the reason I was not as surprised as the others when the day came. It was a casualty run, a man at the southernmost strongpoint with a belly wound who would not live to see the fog lift if it lifted on its own schedule, which down there it might not for a day. The ceiling was on the deck. Prut's gun birds were tucked under their netting. Cole drew the run without a word, and when she saw me hovering at the edge of the pad with my notebook, she looked at me for a long second through the rain and then jerked her chin at the aircraft, which is how I came to be strapped into the back of a utility helicopter flying into a wall of cloud I could not see one body length into. I have flown a great deal. I have never flown like that. She took us down off the shoulder of Calder and into the white, and the white closed over us and I could see nothing, not the ground, not the ridges, not the rotor disc, nothing but gray pressed against the windows like a hand. And she flew through it as if it were glass. She knew the valley? That is the only way I can say it. She knew the floor of the throat the way you know the stairs in your own house in the dark, not by seeing them but by a memory written into the body. She knew where the road bent and she banked before the bend. She knew where the rock shoulder pushed out and she slipped past a thing I could not see. She called her heights and her turns to herself in a low steady voice, more breath than words, and once when a downdraft off an unseen ridge dropped us a sickening distance, she had already corrected before my stomach caught up, because she had known the downdraft was there, had known it the way she knew her own name, because she had flown that exact stretch of fog 100 times hauling the cargo and the body bags they laughed at her for. We were down at the strongpoint inside 15 minutes. The soldiers there did not laugh at her, I marked that. The men who actually depended on those runs, the men at the bottom of the throat with their lives in the balance, they did not call her the taxi. They loaded their dying friend with a tenderness that told me everything, and one of them, a sergeant with a face like a fist, put his hand flat on the side of her aircraft as we lifted, the way you would touch a horse that had carried you out of a fire. On the way back up, I leaned forward against my straps and I asked her into the intercom the question a reporter asks because he cannot help himself. I asked her how she did it. The fog. The flying blind. She was quiet so long I thought she would not answer. Then she said without taking her eyes off the gray, "It's not blind, I just know the room." That was all. I wrote it in my notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady, and beside it I wrote "She knows the room" and I underlined it twice. And then we came up out of the cloud into the gray daylight over Calder and she set us down softer than a kiss, and Prut was standing by his netting watching, and he gave her a little ironic salute, 2 fingers off the brow, the way you salute the taxi when it brings you your fare. She did not return it, she did not even look at him. She shut the aircraft down, signed the book, and went to find the next tasking. And I stood on the pad with the rain coming down and I understood that I had been wrong about Firebase Calder, wrong in the way that should be most humbling to a man who has built his whole life on being right about places like it. I had read the unit in an afternoon, and I had read it exactly backward. There was one other person at Calder who had it right, and I should tell you about him too, because he is the one who put the last piece in my hand. His name was Aletta, and he was the oldest soldier on that firebase by a margin of decades, a senior warrant officer, a chief who had been flying since the gun pilot's fathers were children. He did not fly anymore. He ran the operations center, sat in the sandbagged hut with the radios and the maps and the glowing screens, and he had the stillness about him that very old soldiers have, the stillness of a man who has used up his quota of being surprised. The young pilots called him the chief and treated him with the affectionate condescension the young reserve for the old, listening to his stories with half an ear and then going off to tell their own. I took to drinking my evening coffee in the TOC because Aletta was good company, and because, after the casualty run, I had begun to suspect that the real story of Calder was not on the flight line at all but down on the floor of the throat, in the fog, in the runs nobody wanted. One night I asked him, carefully, what he made of Captain Cole. He looked at me for a while over the rim of his cup. The radios murmured. Somewhere down in the dark a generator droned. "You've heard them call her the taxi," he said. I admitted that I had. I admitted because something in his eyes asked for honesty that I had laughed once. He nodded slowly, not in judgment, just taking it in the way you take in weather. Then he said, "You ever hear the name Avalanche?" I had not, I told him so. He turned back to the maps and did not say anything for a moment, and I thought that was the end of it, the way it so often is with old soldiers who will open a door and then close it again before you can see what's inside. But then he said in a voice gone quiet and careful, there was a valley, few years back, different war near enough. A whole element got cut off, pinned, fixed, going to be overrun by morning. Weather was down on the deck, worse than this, and everybody with sense was grounded. Everybody. He stopped, the screen light moved on his old face. One gun pilot didn't have sense, he said. One gun pilot took a ship down into a hole in the world that nobody else would fly into, and held the high ground over that element alone, all night in and out of that valley on fumes and memory until the relief broke through at first light. Held it alone. They put a call sign on her after that because of how she came down out of that weather on the enemy when they thought the weather had saved them. Came down like the mountain itself let go. He looked at me. Avalanche, he said. I did not say anything. I think my coffee had gone cold in my hand. She doesn't tell it, Aletta said. She doesn't tell any of it. She came here and somebody upstairs who'd never flown a day in the fog decided a pilot with her file was wasted on a gun bird that only flies when the sun's out and would do more good keeping the windpipe open, so they put her on the lift. The hardest flying on this mountain and the only flying that can't ever stop, and they handed it to the one pilot in this troop who's actually done the impossible, and then they let the boys call her the taxi. He shook his head once slowly. I've been doing this 50 years, Maddox. I have stopped being surprised by most things. I have not stopped being surprised by that. I went back to my bunk that night and I lay awake a long time listening to the rain on the roof and the far-off sound of a generator, and once, the rising whine of a turbine as someone took an aircraft up into the dark. I thought about the 2 fingers Prout had flicked off his brow. I thought about the sergeant with the fist face laying his hand flat against the side of her ship. I thought, she knows the room, and I understood now that she knew more rooms than this one, and had stood in one of them alone against the end of the world and come down out of the weather like the mountain letting go. And I lay there and I felt the particular shame of a man who has spent his whole career certain he can tell the lions from the jackals, and who has just learned that the lion had been carrying his bags the whole time and that he had laughed. The fog came down hard 4 days later and it did not lift, and that was the day the throat closed. It began the way these things always begin, with a routine thing going wrong. A resupply column, trucks and a few armored vehicles, our infantry and a section of one of the Allied armies, perhaps 40 souls in all under a young lieutenant named Briggs, was pushing up the throat toward Calder in the gray of the morning when the ceiling was already low and dropping. They were strung out along the narrow road on the floor of the defile, the rock walls rising into cloud on either side, when the ambush opened on them from above. I was in the TOC when the first call came. I had taken to being there in the mornings, and I will be grateful to the end of my life that I was there for this. The radio broke squelch and a voice came out of it, young and tight and trying very hard to be steady and not entirely managing, and the voice said that they were taking fire heavy from the high ground both sides, that they had men down, that they were pinned on the road with the walls of the throat over them like the sides of a grave. Aletta was already moving. I had never seen him move fast and it frightened me more than the radio did. He was at the map and he had the handset, and his old voice had gone flat and enormous and calm, the voice of a man who has been in exactly this room before and knows that the only thing that helps now is calm. He talked Briggs through it, get the vehicles into the lee of the rock, get the wounded behind cover, mark your positions, hold. And Briggs held. You could hear it costing him. You could hear the fire behind his words. The enemy had done it well. They had let the column get deep into the throat, into the narrowest stretch where there was no room to turn the trucks and no way out but forward or back, and then they had opened up from prepared positions on the heights with the whole weight of an ambush. 40 of our men were pinned on the floor of a stone corridor with fighters above them on both sides, and the fighters had the high ground and the cover and the patience, and they would grind that column to pieces over the course of the day unless something came down out of the sky and took the high ground away from them. And nothing could fly. That is the thing you must understand. The gun-birds, Prout's beautiful gray ships, the swagger and the skill, they could not fly. The ceiling was on the deck. The fog filled the throat to the brim and spilled out over the shoulder of Calder, and the rule, the book, the hard physical fact of it was that you do not put an attack helicopter into a fog-choked stone defile, because the defile will kill you before the enemy gets the chance. The rock walls you cannot see will reach out and take your rotor, and you will die, and you will not have helped anyone. Prout came into the TOC at a run with 2 of his pilots behind him, and to his credit, I will always give him this, he wanted to go. He stood over the map with Aletta and he argued for it hot and fast, and I saw in him the thing that made the young men love him, the genuine ache to get into the fight, to be the cavalry, to come over the ridge. But Aletta let him talk and then put one old finger on the map, on the narrow scribble of the throat, and said, "What's the ceiling, son?" Brood stopped. What's the ceiling? Auletta said again, not unkindly, and how do you fly the throat in it? Tell me how, I'll launch you myself if you can tell me how. And Prout could not tell him, because there was no how not for him. He flew the gun bird in the clear, brilliantly, and there was no shame in the limit. It was a real limit and an honest one, but the men in the throat did not need a pilot who could do the possible thing brilliantly. They needed a pilot who could do the impossible thing at all. And Prout stood there over the map with his hands open and his mouth open, and nothing came out. Because for the first time since I had met him there was a thing the fight required and he did not have it, and he was honest enough in that moment to know it. The radio kept talking, Briggs's voice getting tighter. A second voice now, an allied sergeant in accented words, the universal grammar of men who are running out of time. The numbers Auletta wrote on the board got worse. Men down, ammunition burning away. The fighters above them maneuvering now, working down the walls, tightening the noose and the column with nothing to do but bleed and hold and wait for help that the weather had locked in its hangar. And in the doorway of the TOC, soaked, having walked up from the pad through the rain, stood Captain Marin Cole. I do not know how long she had been there. She had the stillness on her that I had seen on the casualty run, the stillness of a person who is doing arithmetic the rest of us cannot see. She looked at the board, she looked at the map, she listened to the radio for the space of 3 breaths, and then she said into the sudden quiet of that hut, in a voice no louder than she had used to tell me it's not blind asterisk, I can fly it. Prout turned on her. I watched it happen. I watched the old reflex come up in him faster than thought, the grin that was about to become the word, the taxi, the medevac girl, the line about cargo and body bags. I watched it rise in his face out of pure habit, because that was the shape his contempt had worn for months, and the body reaches for the worn shape. You don't put a ship in the throat in this, he started, and there was the ghost of the grin on it. You don't hand a fight like this to somebody who's whole. Chief Prout, Auletta did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He said the name the way you set down something heavy, and Prout stopped. The old man looked at him, and then he looked at her, at Cole standing dripping in the doorway, and something passed over his face that I can only call relief, the relief of a man who has been waiting a long time for the one card that wins. Say again, Captain, Auletta said to her. Say it so the room hears it. I can fly the throat in this, she said. She had not moved. The rain ran off her. I've flown it 40 times. I know where the walls are. I know the downdrafts off the east shoulder, and I know the dead air past the second bend, and I know the floor of that defile in 0 visibility, because that is the run none of you wanted. She said it without heat. That is the part I cannot get over telling it now. There was no heat in her, no triumph, no I told you so trembling under the words. She was simply laying out the facts of the matter the way she laid her hand on a rotor blade. Put the rockets and the gun on the lift bird I can take, and I'll go down there and take the high ground away from them and hold it until that column is out. I need a fuel load and I need somebody to keep talking to Briggs, that's all I need. The room was silent. The radio talked into the silence, Briggs, his voice cracking now, asking in the bare plain way men do when they have stopped expecting good news whether anyone was coming. And Auletta keyed the handset and said, Throat element, this is Calder, hold what you've got. Cavalry's inbound, you hear me, hold. Then he turned to Cole and said one word. Go. I followed her out. Nobody told me to, and nobody told me not to, and I have spent my life going where I am not told, and I was not going to miss this if it killed me. I followed her out into the rain to the pad, where the ground crew were already swarming the aircraft she'd be taking, wrestling the weapons onto it, the rocket pods and the gun, the whole violent weight of it. And I stood back out of the way at the edge of the netting with my notebook turning to pulp in the rain, and I watched her get ready to do the thing. She did not hurry. I have told you that about her, and here is where it mattered most. With 40 men dying in a stone corridor 20 minutes flight away with the clock running in everyone's chest, she did her checks at exactly the speed she always did them, because the checks are what keep you alive, and a check done in a hurry is a check not done. She walked the aircraft. She ran her gloved hand along the blades. She checked the loads the crew had hung. She climbed up and strapped in and ran the start, and the turbine caught and rose into its whine, and the rotor began to turn, slow and then fast, and the rotor wash came off it in a great flat circle and flattened the rain into a stinging silver sheet that drove us all back from the pad. The ground crew finished and dropped away, and just before she pulled in the power to lift, in the half-second of stillness before the ship came light on its wheels, I saw Prout. He had come out too. He stood at the other edge of the pad with his 2 pilots, the men who an hour before would have laughed at the word taxi, and he was not laughing now, and he was not grinning, and the swagger had gone out of him entirely. He stood there in the rain and the rotor wash with his hands at his sides, and he watched her go up. And on his face was the beginning of a thing I would not see complete for another 2 hours. The slow, terrible arithmetic of a man recalculating everything he had decided he knew. She lifted off, and she dropped off the shoulder of Calder into the fog, and the fog took her, and she was gone from sight inside 3 seconds. And I want you to hold on to that the last any of us saw of her was a gray ship sliding into a wall of cloud that every rule and every instinct and every other pilot on that mountain said was death, because that is the moment the men of Calder began, all of them at once, to understand what she was. We crowded back into the TOC. There was nothing to see now, there was only the radio. And the radio is where the rest of it lives, in my memory, and I think in the memory of every man who was in that hut, because we could not watch it, we could only hear it, and hearing a thing in the dark while you are helpless to touch it burns it into you in a way that watching never does. Auletta had the handset. He kept Briggs talking, "Hold, throat element, hold, she's coming," and he kept the net clear for her, and the rest of us stood pressed around the map staring at the empty scribble of the throat as though if we stared hard enough we could see down through the rock and the fog to the thing happening below. The first we heard of her was her voice, low and even, the voice from the intercom on the casualty run, the voice that called its heights to itself more breath than words. She was talking herself down into the throat. We heard fragments: a height, a turn, the east shoulder, the dead air past the second bend, the private liturgy of a pilot flying a corridor she could not see by a map she carried in her body. And under her voice, the fog. You could hear the fog in the radio somehow, the muffled, enormous silence of it, the sense of a ship sliding through a white nothing with stone walls a wingspan away on either side. And then the floor of the throat must have opened under her, because her voice changed. "Throat element, avalanche." The call sign came out of her for the first time, flat and clear, and I saw Auletta's old hand tighten on the handset. "I'm over you, I have you, I'm taking the high ground." I have tried many times to write what came next, because it is my trade to write things, and I have never been satisfied, and I will not be satisfied now. There are some things that the men who were not there cannot be made to feel, and the 9 minutes that followed are one of them. But I will tell you what we heard. We heard her go to work. The radio carried the rest of it in pieces, in her voice and in the rising and falling roar that came up under her words. The sound of the gun and the rockets reaching down out of the fog onto the men on the heights who had believed, until that moment, that the weather was their friend. She had come down into the one place no aircraft could come, the way Auletta said she had come down once before, like the mountain letting go, and she fell on the ambush positions from the inside of the cloud that was supposed to protect them. She called her targets to herself. We heard the heights, the turns, the corrections, and we heard, threaded through it, the discipline of it, the methodical murderous patience of a pilot who was not raging and was not lucky and was not gambling but was doing very fast and very precisely, a thing she had trained her whole life to do and had done before when it was even worse. She took the east wall first because the east wall had the heavy gun, and she knew the east shoulder's wind, and she came in on it from the angle the downdraft would let her hold, and the heavy gun went silent. Then she crossed the throat, crossed it in the fog between the walls she could not see, on the memory of 40 taxi runs, and she took the west wall and worked it down position by position, while Briggs's voice climbed up out of despair into something I had not heard in it before, which was hope, and then, my God, which was joy. "They're breaking," Briggs said. "Calder, they're breaking off the high ground there," and then a sound came over the net that I had not heard from a soldier in a long time, a kind of laugh that is mostly a sob, the sound a man makes when he has decided he is going to die and then suddenly learns he is not. And over it, level, unhurried, the same voice she would have used to tell me the fog was not blind. "Throat element, avalanche, high grounds clear, get your vehicles rolling, I'll hold the walls, go now." They went. The column unpinned itself from the floor of the throat and ran for its life up the windpipe of the mountain, and over them, unseen in the fog, she held. She stayed down in that stone corridor between walls she could not see, turning in the dead air past the second bend, watching for the fighters to come back, ready for them, while 40 men and their dead and their wounded clawed their way up and out into the gray. She was the last thing between them and the noose, and she stayed until the noose was empty, and only when Briggs called that they were clear of the narrows did her voice come up over the net one final time to say, "Throat elements out. Avalanche is coming home." Then she had to fly the throat back up in the fog, the way she had come down, blind and not blind, on the memory in her hands, and I will tell you that the silence in the TOC during those minutes was the loudest silence I have ever stood inside. Aletta stood with the handset against his chest and his eyes closed. Prout stood at the map with his hands flat on it, leaning as though he could push her up out of the throat with the strength of his arms. Nobody breath. And then a voice came on the net that was not hers. It was an allied voice, one of the strongpoint sergeants down the throat, and he had been listening, the whole valley had been listening, and he keyed his radio just to say in his careful accented English, "Calder, that pilot, who is that pilot?" And Aletta opened his eyes, and he looked around that hut at the young gun pilots and the soaked old correspondent and the broad still shape of Prout bent over the map, and he keyed the handset and he answered the question the whole valley had asked, in a voice that I will hear in my head until I die. "That's Avalanche," he said. "She held a valley alone once in worse than this all night against the end of the world. They wrote her up for it. They gave her that name for the way she comes down out of the weather." He paused. The radio hissed. "She's been flying your taxi for 3 months. You owe her your lives, and so do I, and so does every man on this mountain who ever called her anything less than what she is." He let go of the key, and in the silence after it I watched the last of the arithmetic finish in Prout's face. I watched the grin he had worn for 3 months, the easy contempt, the 2 fingers off the brow. I watched it all burn away, and what was left underneath it was not a man humiliated, which is what I had braced for. It was a man ashamed in the clean way, the way that can still make something of a person. He stood up off the map. He went pale, exactly as Aletta had said she had once made a war room go pale. And then, without a word to anyone, he turned and walked out into the rain toward the pad. We followed, all of us. The whole TOC emptied out onto the flight line in the rain to wait, and word had gone through Calder the way word does, and the infantry came, and the engineers came, and the Allied soldiers came. And by the time the sound of her turbine rose up out of the fog below the shoulder of the mountain, there were perhaps 200 men standing in the rain on that flight line with their faces turned toward the sound. She came up out of the cloud the way she had gone down into it, with no drama, sliding up over the lip of the shoulder and settling toward the pad through her own rotor wash. And the ship was marked now, scarred along one side where she had taken fire holding the walls, a long bright tear in the gray paint, and she brought it down onto the pad as softly as she had set me down after the casualty run, softer than a kiss, after 9 minutes inside the impossible and a blind climb back out of it. The rotor wound down, the great flat circle of wash collapsed into stillness, and the rain came straight again. And in the quiet, before she had even fully opened the canopy, Prout stepped forward to the front of the crowd, alone, out ahead of all of them, and he came to attention. I had seen him salute her before, 2 fingers off the brow. The taxi salute, the one you give the fare. This was not that. This was the whole of him, heels together, spine straight, the rain running off the brim of his cover and down his face, his hand coming up slow and exact to the precise angle that a salute is supposed to have and almost never does, because almost no salute means what this one meant. He held it. He did not waver. And behind him, raggedly at first and then all at once, the whole flight line came to attention, and the whole flight line saluted, 200 men in the rain, our infantry and the Allied soldiers and the engineers and the young gun pilots who had laughed, all of them, saluting the pilot they had called the taxi. She climbed down out of the aircraft. She was small next to it, and tired. You could see the tired in her now that it was over, the way it comes up in a person once the thing that needed them is done. She came around the nose of the ship and she saw the flight line, the 200 men, the salute, Prout out front of them holding his with the rain on his face, and she stopped. I was close enough to see her face, and I will tell you what was not on it. There was no triumph on it. There was no "I told you so" asterisk, no flicker of the thing that would have been so human and so forgivable, the small hot pleasure of the vindicated. She looked at the salute the way she looked at everything, levelly, without performance, taking the measure of it. And then she did the only thing she could do. The thing that I think told me more about her than the 9 minutes in the throat had, more than the casualty run, more than anything Aletta said. She came to attention herself, and she returned it, to all of them, to the men who had laughed. She gave them back their honor as plainly and as cleanly as she had taken the high ground, and she held the salute the proper length, and then she cut it, and the line cut with her, and it was done. Prout walked up to her after, when the crowd had begun to break apart into the murmur and motion of men who have just witnessed something they will be telling for the rest of their lives. I was near enough to hear, and I am not ashamed that I stayed near enough to hear, because this was the part my whole trade existed to carry. He stood in front of her, the broad, easy man with the swagger gone out of him for good, and he did not make a speech which I respected, and he did not grovel, which she would not have wanted. He said, "I called you the taxi." "I know," she said. "In front of the men for 3 months." He swallowed. The rain ran down his face, and I do not think all of it was rain. "I was wrong about you, Captain. I was wrong in a way I'm going to be a while making right." She looked at him for a moment. And then she said the thing that I wrote down last of all, the thing I built the torn-up story around, the thing I have carried out of that valley and kept. You weren't wrong about the runs, she said. Somebody has to fly the taxi. It's the hardest flying on this mountain, and it's the only flying that can't ever stop, and most people can't do it at all. She let that sit. I just wish you'd known that before you decided it was beneath you. The man who flies the body bags down the throat in the fog every day without anybody clapping, he's worth more than I am. You ought to learn his name. Then she signed the book, the way she always did, and she went off to find the next tasking, because there is always a next tasking, and the fog had not lifted, and somewhere down the throat there would be a man bleeding who did not care what anyone called the pilot, only that she came. I tore up the story I had come to write. I want to tell you that plainly because it is the truest thing I know how to say about all of this. I had come to Calder to write about the lions of the air, the young swaggering gun pilots, the cavalry over the ridge, and I had been so certain, with the certainty of an old man who has built his life on reading rooms in an afternoon, that I knew which one of them was the story, and I had laughed at the taxi. The story was the taxi. The story was the pilot they barred from the gun bird and slotted to haul the cargo and the body bags, the one who had held a valley alone in worse weather than this against the end of the world and never once told anyone, the one who knew the room when no one else could see the walls. The story was a woman who came down out of the impossible like the mountain letting go, and broke an ambush in 9 minutes and brought 40 men up out of a stone grave, and then came to attention and gave the men who had mocked her back their honor without keeping any of the satisfaction for herself. I have stood on a lot of flight lines in my life. I told you that you can tell almost everything about a unit by how the men talk about the pilot nobody respects. What I did not say, because I did not yet know it, is that you can tell almost everything about yourself by the same measure by which laughter you join and which you are ashamed of after, and whether the shame teaches you anything. It taught me. I am an old man and it is late for lessons, but it taught me. I have never since walked onto a fire base certain I could read it in an afternoon. I look now for the pilot they call the taxi. I look for the one doing the hardest flying with no one clapping. And when I find that one, and there is always that one, I have learned to wait and to watch and to keep my laughter to myself, because the mountain is full of weather you cannot see into, and you never know which gray ship is going to slide down into it and hold the high ground alone until the rest of us are safe. Her name was Marin Cole. They called her Avalanche. I owe her the story I should have written, and this is it, and I have never been sorry.